Hello and welcome to Chat Room presented to you by China Global Television Network. I'm Yanjiao, CGTN reporter. It's been 16 days since the outbreak of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And despite 3 rounds of negotiations and a foreign ministers level talk that took place yesterday, we didn't see any trend so far to ease this conflict. So we decided to turn to another topic, the future. From the potential military actions in the next stage to the future fate of Lugansk and Donetsk, as well as Ukraine, Russia, and Europe. Ultimately, what kind of the world that each one of us will live in the coming decades. Joining us today in the chat room are Kent Huang, Chief Editor of Russian Service CGTN, Shen Shuwei, Politics Analyst, and Qiao Liang, Socialist in International and Chinese Politics. Also, expert and stringer around the world will also join us live later. They are Mr. Wang Xiaowei, our international affairs expert in Beijing, Dmitry Burtsev near Lviv, Daniel Hawkins in Moscow, and Guy Henderson in London. We also invite you to be part of this conversation by sending us the top 8 questions that you want us to talk in this chat room to stringer@cgtn.com. And also you can check out a CGTN YouTube channel where you can participate in a poll to show us your preferences on those topics. As usual, gentlemen, we started this conversation with the latest situation on the battlefields. In Kiev, satellite images show the 64 kilometers long Russian convoy outside Kiev has largely dispersed and redeployed. The forces are fanning out into forest and small towns around Kiev with artillery pieces moved into firing position. Kent, can you show us those the whole picture of the battlefields on our map? Okay. Maybe we could start from the Kiev, as this the latest information mentioned about this. The Russian convoy has been redeployed. Are we expect to see more progress on the military operation?
Yes. Okay. 我们来看一下这个地图。
So let's look at the map together.
Can we have the map now?
Okay, thank you. 我们先来看一下这个基辅啊。 那么基辅呢？这个目前呢，俄军啊
So we can look at Kiev
基辅的北侧
from the northern part of Kiev.
稍等一下。
So maybe we have to readjust the map.
哦。好吧。俄军呢是从这个基辅的北侧。
From the southern point of Kiev and also the western part of Kiev, they are encircling the city.
Ken,
但是呢，进展比较缓慢。
We didn't see Kiev. This is not.
Kiev， 好像这个可能是。 Okay, maybe a technical.
It's eastern part of Ukraine.
Yeah. 我已经调到这个，这样这边还看不见。
Our production team, can we change a map?
No, I think we lost the contact with the screen. Well, maybe.
Can we deal with the map?
没关系，这样吧，那个咱们简单说一下吧。
It's okay. I'll just brief you.
So somebody. 谁把这个给我拿一下？
Ken, you can.
OK. 是这样，我们简单说一下。
So I'll just brief you without the map. Currently, the Russian troops towards the northern part and also western part, they are encircling Kiev. However, their progress has been very slow. We have also mentioned Bucha and Irpin, very close to the capital city. In the 2 places, the Russian troops have encountered very strong defense from the Ukrainian troops, and yesterday the 2 sides they have declared 12 hours of ceasefire for the sake of the humanitarian corridors in that area. The fight is not very heavy, and most of the troops they are deployed in the eastern part of Kiev. From the satellite images for the 2 sides, their media reports have mentioned armored vehicle troops. They have been deployed in the eastern part of Kiev. That is about 9 kilometers away from the downtown center area. And the 2 troops, they may go into a fight in the eastern part of the capital city. So that is the basic situation for the capital city. So no major fights.
Also in Mariupol, the Russian forces' bombardment of the Mariupol continued on Thursday. Ukraine claimed that Russian strikes targeted a children's hospital, leaving 3 dead and 17 injured. Zelensky said humanitarian corridors in Mariupol and neighboring Bonovaka remain completely impassable due to Russian shelling. So it seems that, do we have Matthew today? Do we have a Matthew in? Matthew is in Kharkiv.
In Kharkiv, it's a different place.
And also we have some latest developments in Kharkiv. The Russian forces shell a nuclear research institute in Kharkiv, which is the Ukraine's second largest city, on Thursday, setting buildings on fire, according to the Ukraine Interior Ministry. Can you want to update? Give us some updates on those lines?
我们现在是这个在这个地区呢，实
And
际
in
还
this
是相
region,
对平静的，
it's
而且
relatively
可预见的这
peaceful.
个激战呢，
And we can
也不
also
太可能
expect
发生
that no
至少在今
major
天这个目前不太
intense
在哈尔科夫
crossfires
呢
can take place
俄军呢
today.
还是主要在做迂回动作。当然此
And
前
they are
呢
also
这个
making
原来这
the
个包围圈呢，它
zigzagging
是
moves,
有
and the
松动的，因为
encircling
俄军呢
moves have
有
also
这个
been
很多的
loosened
动作。
for the sake of the rest and the break. And some of the troops, they have already reached the Kharkiv, and they are moving towards the southern parts. And the major direction of their advancement is towards Donetsk region and also Mariupol in the southern part of the country. So the majority of their troops are deployed there. And you can also find the most effective troop forces from the Ukrainian side. So Russian troops in this round of special military operation, their first target is to eliminate the effective troops of the Ukrainian side and not only the occupation of the city.
What is your forecast about the Russians' military operation? The next stage of the Russian military operation, which city or which areas are expected to be targeted?
So my observation is that the Russian troops and also the two self-declared republics, they will still push their front lines to their claimed boundaries and to consolidate their actual control of those areas. If we go through Moscow's demands in this kind of peace talks, they want the Ukraine government to give kind of recognition to these two self-declared republics, and then that's why they want to consolidate their this kind of actual control. And also for the Mariupol, it is in a very strategic location linking Crimea to Donetsk, and also it's also a passage to the Lugansk in the long run. So that's why this place is also very important for Russian troops. That's why there are very fierce fighting around here, and especially when most of the Ukrainian armies are still gathering here to fight with the Russian troops. So I think these regions will still remain as the key targets in the next stage military operation.
However, if we look at the bigger picture from the strategic point of view, we're also very clear that for the Russian side, if they are engaged in a long-term ground battle and after the occupation of certain cities of Ukraine, they have to play that skill of guerrilla, and that is unrealistic and is not included in the plan. So a more realistic option for them is to close this operation as soon as possible so that they can prepare for the further diplomatic and political solutions. And also, according to the Chinese mindset, they have to respect that every side has also their bottom line. And in the short term, a massive conflict will be ended soon.
It involves more than just Russia and Ukraine, because right now the U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is visiting Poland. So we can definitely see that other great powers are trying to get involved, especially helping Ukraine to hold Russia as long as possible. So definitely this conflict has taken more days than many of us have expected.
Yeah, gentlemen, I have some latest news that says the military forces from the Donetsk has announced they have liberated the city of the Volnovakha. Where is that city and why is it so important?
对，您提到这个城市叫沃诺瓦卡。
Volnovakha.
对，沃诺瓦卡这个名字比较难读啊。这是
The name is very hard to read. It's not far from Donetsk. Actually, it's a very small town. It has a limited surface. However, it has a very important strategic position because it's located in the Donetsk front line for the government troops. If we can control this place of Volnovakha, then for the defense troops of Donetsk, they can continue towards the southern part and also try to encircle Mariupol. And over the past few days, you can witness that for the two sides, they have captured and lost in repeated manner the city. And for the southern part, in general, for the battlefield of the Ukrainian troops, there have been fierce crossfires in Donetsk. The local militias and also the military powers, and they have already made some breakthrough from the eastern part.
Yes, we have seen this very fierce battle in the south line of in Ukraine. And also, as we talked about as the battlefields operation, there is more comments that has been, we have been left some comments on our Facebook page. And one of them said, I see Twitter and Facebook now allow calls for violence against the Russians. Are we being programmed by big tech that a little violence against other races is acceptable? I think you mentioned about Facebook and Instagram's the latest movement. These two apps are allowing the post in some countries that call for violence against Russian and Russian soldiers, as well as for the death of Russian and their leaders. So Shui, what's your takes on this, the latest on the social media?
Actually, I think this kind of training is a little bit very dangerous move because you see, as a platform, very influential platform, social media, they are shaping people's attitude. They are shaping people's attitude towards this war, and when they inciting this kind of like a death threat, I think that is not the good with very good intention because. Now the information, disinformation and the misinformation are still happening, and there are a lot of fake news also. So it is not the time for this kind of influential platform to inciting people to kill each other. So it must keep kind of neutrality and to have more their resources for the fact check and also to ban those kind of misinformation and disinformation issue to give the people a proper understanding about what is happening right now and what will going on. And inciting war doesn't have a very good consequences because if they encourage those people, especially the countries, allow the people living around Russia to attack, to have this kind of verbal attack on social media towards Russia. So what they can get, of course, they will get a fight back from Russian sides, and that will further escalate the chaos on the social media. And in the real life, people will get more anger, and that is not helpful to de-escalate the current tensions and especially the battlefields. And if that will be worse, what about the consequences on the battlefields? That will anger the soldiers in the front line, and that is totally unacceptable, I think, from the humanitarian perspective, and that doesn't fit the kind of motto in this kind of social media platforms. So I don't think it's acceptable.
Yeah, so domestically, Facebook is known for being politically very active in terms of political campaigns and elections in American politics. Now, this is nearly the first time that actually internationally Facebook is operated as a platform calling for violence against Russia, even though this is like a very new recent event. But what I would like to bring out is actually these platforms are internationally operated, but they are not obliged to each nation's legal framework. So this is actually some new phenomenon that we need to pay attention to and just talk about maybe in the future. What are the big tech's role in terms of international warfares?
Yeah, especially the platforms, they have their own regulations to bind this kind of violence. But now it is the platform is inciting this kind of violence. So maybe we need to for the regulators to have more details on these issues and what is the boundary for this kind of call for violence. And I don't think it's from humanitarian perspective that is not acceptable.
应该说可能是不是开了一个非常不好的先例
Maybe that is a very bad example to set there. For media platforms, we have to hold a neutral and balanced point of view. And for social media, could we consider them as a real media? That is also a question mark. Of course, social media can bring us a lot of conveniences, but at the same time, there are also a lot of inconveniences. For example, the generation of this abundant information sources for the disinformation generated on the social media platform, and also those calls and the words, speeches calling for violence, bad influence on the society.
Okay, we've been joined by more of our guests and streamers online. I think it's Daniel Hawkins is joining us in Moscow, and Mr. Wang Xiaowei, our international issue expert, will be joining us in Beijing, and also Dmitry Burtsev joining us in Ukraine. He's in somewhere near Lviv. So, gentlemen, we just talked about the Facebook's the new announcement about opposed to violence against the Russians. What's your take on this latest move? Daniel, maybe we'll start from you. You're right now in Moscow.
Yeah, hi. I mean, this is certainly sets a dangerous precedent. We do know that it's become increasingly difficult to access various social media platforms in Russia already. If not completely banned, people need to use the VPN to access sites such as Twitter, such as Facebook. And really, you ask, what's the purpose? What's the point of all this? Because the executives at these social media giants must know the Russian authorities' reaction, which will be quite understandably, because these platforms are calling for direct violence against Russians and Russian forces, will be to further crack down. And I mean, the point of these sanctions against Russia is to put pressure on the Kremlin, to put pressure on Mr. Putin. But a lot of the time, what they're doing is putting pressure on and limiting access to information to ordinary people. And that actually has the opposite effect of what's going on. You're finding a lot of people, as a result of these sorts of sanctions imposed, are actually becoming more defiant and more resistant, and actually expressing their anger not towards the Kremlin or to the government, but towards Western companies which are putting these sanctions in and which are putting such policies in. And certainly, of course, I can't imagine 15, 20 years ago, these social media giants allowing content that would call for violence against, for example, US soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've got no doubt that those sorts of calls, those sorts of accounts would be banned pretty quickly. So certainly we are seeing an element of double standards here by these social media giants, which are clearly taking a highly political, extremely political side in this conflict.
Yeah, Dmitro. Hi, Dmitro. I want to hear this point from you, because we understand this Ukrainian people's feeling now about the Russian. But what's your take on the Facebook and Instagram's new rules that are allowing the post in some countries that call for violence against the Russian? Do you think what's your take on this?
Good morning, gentlemen. It's really good morning for me to be able to see all of you here. And well, I'll start from your question, and I'll add some points to our Chinese experts about military operation on the ground. So about that hostility language on online platforms, I don't think it's a kind of acceptable too bad. Well, but if you can manage, well, you can see the Western platforms, but it also exists so-called VK or Russian platform, which actually which is Russian social media, which is mostly used in Russia. So I'm a user of that platform. As a Ukrainian, I also can see the hostility to Ukrainian on that platform.
Okay.
So that's also the point that pro-Russian platforms, they show the violence towards Ukrainians, they show fake news about Ukrainians. So as for me, it already looks like a battle of social networks.
No, I mean, what about this? Let's focus on the Facebook's the new rules. Do you think it's because the Facebook's supposed to be a platform that everyone could be involved? I understand what you said about this the social media app in Russia. There might have this situation like what you said, what you mentioned. But on the Facebook, which is the more global platform, do you think it's fair enough to put this kind of the rules into their algorithm?
Well, that's, as for me, even as for Ukrainian, that's a bit too tough. A bit too tough. And I want to add some words to the comments of our Chinese experts about like situation on the ground, what happens on the fronts now.
Oh,
because if you allow me, of course.
Yeah,
so
go ahead. Go ahead. We just talked about this. We talked about two topics at the same time. We talked about the military operation, and then we just turned to a little bit on a Facebook issue. But it's okay. We can get back.
Yeah. So we get back. I want to tell some words that actually, according to what Ukrainian military specialists say, the situation is heavy. It's still difficult, but is already controlled by Ukrainian military. That's already good. Well, they stabilized all direction except southern. But as you can see from the first day of war, Ukrainian, it was no big battles at the south of Ukraine, right? As we can, well, I think that's a kind of even a strategy of Ukrainian army, because Ukraine was preparing for this war for already like kind of half of a year. And it's obvious they were thinking about the strategy. They were thinking about the way how to deal with the situation. And the southern region, this kind of plain region, it's no place to hide, it's no place to go. So Ukrainian army just left that place, just left. I suppose some military is still there, but they're hidden in somewhere. So to be able to create some pressure on Russian army from the backside. And the main direction on the south are Mykolaiv and Odessa. So they move from Crimea towards north and towards west, to the bigger cities. But as the governor of Mykolaiv region, Kim, yesterday said in his speech, and because he is actually a very bright person of Ukrainian media, Ukraine is ready to create green corridors for Russian military.
What do you mean by green corridors?
It means that Russian military can safety, if they put down guns, they can come over Ukrainian side.
Okay, I got it. So
that's the condition. Yeah, actually, that he showed in his Instagram on media platforms, and this message is very bright. And he said his message was like that: we know that you don't want to fight with us, and if you'll put down your weapons and just go through the green corridors Ukrainian army gonna create, you'll be peacefully. You can be, you can leave the war without any punishment. Of course, it's two kinds of. It's kind of not, but except artillery, of course, because artillery destroy everything what they can't see, and usually it's some peaceful people and just locals who. Not non-combatants, I can say like
Dmitry.
that.
Okay, Dmitry. Since you have to mention about you have to bring this discussion back to the latest developments on a military operation. How about we start with our first topics today? Because I think you might just have missed the beginning of this discussion. Because and I'm trying to repeat this. The topic today, we're going to focus on the forecast of the future today. So from the military operation to the future of Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and everything, this is our major topic today. So that'll be, I think all of us, our guests, especially those who join us online, might miss out the beginning parts of this discussion. So let's get back to our first topic. Gentlemen, what do you think? When will this military conflict between Russia and Ukraine end? So I want to hear from everyone your perspective. Maybe you can give us a very, very sharp conclusion first, and then you can expand with your reasons. Maybe you want to start? Maybe from Shui.
Okay.
Shui, you go.
I think it's pretty hard for this kind of predictions, but I think if we compare the situation from Georgia, that the conflict has continued
No,
for.
can you just tell me?
No. I don't think it's a situation compared with Georgia. It's another question. Yes. It's another question.
Yeah, but maybe
it's
2 or 3 months.
Give us a very fast conclusion. When do you think this things will end? This military operation will end?
At least 3 months.
At least 3 months.
No, I don't think. I think maybe.
What's your point?
10 days or 15 days.
10 days to 15 days.
10 to 15, yeah.
Well, I think when Russia no longer feels threatened by expansion of NATO, then that'll be the time.
No, 50 days, maximum 20 days or 30 days, or 1 month.
Yeah. Let our discussion first keep in this chat room. Give me your reasons for your conclusion, and then we can turn to our guest online for their judgment.
Okay, sure, please.
So Shui, 3 months, right? 3
Yeah,
months. Why do you think it's a 3 months?
At least 3 months is because several points. First is about the peace negotiation. The demands, they have huge gaps. For example, Moscow wants the Ukraine government to recognize Russia's sovereignty over Crimea, and also to recognize the 2 self-declared republics. And the second one is the first point that the Ukraine government cannot accept that kind of condition. The second part is that for the 2 self-declared republics, they want to have the full control of the this kind of 2 states within Ukraine, especially during the Ukraine government's administration periods. So now there are still some military operation there. So because the 2 armed forces, they want to push the boundary to what they claimed, but apparently the military operation haven't finished yet. And the third point, I think, for the Ukraine government to propose the new non-NATO model or kind of neutrality, that will took a pretty long time to reach kind of agreement, especially from the major powers negotiations. So I think at least 3 months of military operation, because major parties are using this kind of military operation as a bargaining chip in the peace negotiations. So if they cannot get what they want from the military ground, from the military operation, they cannot get that from the peace negotiation table either. So that is my point. But I think the situation is pretty unpredictable. Yeah.
这个主要是取决于您如何定义
Well, it depends how you describe the special military operation. If you consider the following up mediation on a political and diplomatic level, then 3 months will not be enough. However, for us to put an end to this military operation in the next 10 to 20 days, for the massive military conflicts on the ground can be completed for several considerations. First of all, huge consumptions of forces on both sides, considering that the long-term support of this high-level and high-intensity battles would be very hard for Russian side or for the Ukrainian side. It can be quite challenging for both sides. And secondly, for the political considerations, for both sides, they don't have the intention to prolong this conflict to a long-term one. At least for the Russian side, they would like to put an end to this military operation and go back to the diplomatic and political negotiation table as soon as possible. And we can also read similar message from the speeches and also message delivered by the top leaders from the Ukrainian side.
Very brief translation for our guest online, because they cannot hear the translator. Ken just to mention about the both sides have a very strong intention to make this conflict as short as possible, especially for the Russian side. So there are a very strong intention in both sides to sit down on a negotiation table.
Yeah, each party has their own, each party, I mean Russia and Ukraine has their own narratives about the conflict. So I think at a certain point, maybe each party will claim that we have defeated the other party and we have won this conflict, and that will be the point to stop. But I don't have a timeline for that.
So you don't make any forecast on.
当然你可以不设一个这个大体的这个期限啊，
Of course, you can choose not to set a timeline because there are so many uncertainties there. It's very hard to tell the future from current point. But personally, I believe that in the near future, we can put an end to this massive
conclusion that this conflict will be end very soon. But apparently, Xu Wei said it's going to take like 3 or more months. It's a bit longer. Okay. So let's hear from our guest online. So Daniel, I want to hear your forecast on this military operation. How long do you think it's going to end?
Well, I mean, to start with, I think I would respectfully slightly disagree with the colleague in the studio that both sides want to see a very quick end to the conflict. Certainly, a drawn-out conflict is not beneficial to the governments. To the people or the governments on either side. I think Russia certainly wants some sort of negotiated peace treaty signed as soon as possible. In the terms of Zelensky and Kiev, it's hard to see what their end game is, because as I've said before, militarily for the conventional Ukrainian army, it's impossible to win this conflict in the short, medium or long term. The odds are simply stacked against them. And Zelensky here faces a tough choice really between effectively political suicide for himself by signing some sort of peace treaty with Russia that would, in Kiev's eyes, compromise Ukraine's territorial integrity with regards to Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk, or carry on a war, a conflict, which ultimately is leading to increased loss of life. But the longer the conflict is drawn out, of course, by Zelensky, the more support Kiev, Ukraine will get from NATO allies and from the West. We saw the UK express the decision to bring man-pad Starstreak missiles, anti-aircraft, very high-tech anti-aircraft weaponry to Ukraine just, I believe, over the last 24 hours. And the strategy, I think, from the Kiev government right now is quite the opposite. They know that a short-term victory, a quick victory, is impossible. Their aim right now is exactly the opposite, to draw out this conflict for as long as possible, to bog down Russian troops, to inflict maximum damage, and wait for the sanctions which have been imposed by Western powers on Russia to start hitting Russia's economy really hard. So I think in terms of their interest, it's actually beneficial for this conflict to be long and drawn out. And we've seen comparisons before that Ukraine could be Russia's next Chechnya or next Afghanistan. We saw the losses the Russian military incurred in those conflicts, the lack of domestic support they had in those conflicts. So I think in terms of Kiev, it is quite the opposite. And we've seen Russian military tactics, returning very briefly just to that topic, if I may, on the battlefield, adapting to that. Just looking at the latest war maps that are coming in from various analysts, from Ukraine, from Moscow as well, the Russian military is slightly changing their tactics. For example, when you look at the offensive to take Kiev, right now, we saw that big Russian column moving in from the north, many kilometers long. As you say, they've now dispersed because they became vulnerable to ambushes and surprise attacks from Ukrainian forces, both regular army and military groups, paramilitary groups. They've now focused on a new tactic coming in from the east of Kiev, and we see Russian pressure now on the city of Brovary, fighting around Obukhir in the south as well. Their aim now is to surround Kiev because they know that they don't have the capacity militarily in the capital to defend it from all sides. We saw, as our guest from Ukraine also said, pressure on Mykolaiv as well, moving north. The aims of the Russian military now are really to consolidate the gains they've made in the south, in the southeast, and to move northwards along the outline of the Dnieper River to take Kiev, which will be very much a symbolic turning point in the war should we see the Russian forces take that. So in terms of the future of the conflict, I think, yes, both sides are suffering losses. And clearly, for all sides, it's better that none of this ever happened, of course, no doubt about that. But they do have slightly different aims, because as long as these images of bombing and shelling of civilian casualties do keep being put into the public conscience worldwide, Ukraine will continue to receive military aid and support, and it's hard to see what the end game is. And we've seen people already say, look, where are these weapons going to end up? Even Western analysts are saying these man-pads, these other weaponry, in an environment, in the chaotic environment of war, these weapons could end up with criminal groups. These weapons could end up with terrorist groups. It's easy to see in the short run what the aim of the Western powers is, to flood Ukraine with weapons and provide the Ukrainian army with the capability it needs to fight the Russians. So in the long run, though, this tactic is not thought through properly.
So Daniel, you mean as long as they have they're both the objective for both sides cannot be matched with each other, the military operation won't stop on the ground?
I think what many Western powers, Western leaders don't understand is the Kremlin has its clear objectives. It's expressed them. Mr. Lavrov yesterday after the meeting with Mr. Kuleba and Antalya made very clear, repeated what they were. No amount of sanctions right now is going to change those objectives and change the intentions of that. And as I say, it's hard to see what Mr. Zelensky really is waiting for, because militarily, as I say, there's no end in the short term to this conflict. They have to get to the negotiating table with more productivity than they did yesterday, because yesterday's talks rather made very little, if any, headway at all, to be honest.
Yeah, that's a problem, because as Daniel said, the point has been made very clearly, but the point is the Western leaders don't listen, right? Let's hear the points from Dmitry. Hi, Dmitry. What's your forecast on this conflict? How long do you think it will be lasting?
Well, first of all, I want to agree that different sides have different narratives, as my colleague in Moscow said, different programs, different aims, and for Russia, long-lasting war, it will be second Chechnya or second Afghanistan. So it will be great losses, and as also this colleague said, Russian tactic is tough. It's not flexible. They're moving in columns, and Ukrainians stop defending, like making big fights with these columns. The main tactic is like making ambushes, destroy the lines of supplies, and the tactics like strike and escape. So destroy as much as you can, and just escape in the field or in the forest, as you can see as the north of Ukraine. So that's why the fights, it's almost no fights on the south. It's no place to hide for military and tactics. It's bad tactics for open place. As for decision of the conflict, I suppose it will be over within 2 weeks.
Within 2 weeks?
Why? Within 2 weeks. At least an active phase.
So you agree with Kent? The Kent said it's going to be finished within like 15 days or 20 days. So.
Yeah, around that time, but maybe it will be some terminal phase. Maybe it will be some like frozen phase, but it'll still be over soon.
Yeah, go ahead with your.
But as for my opinion, the reason is coming from the battlefield, where Russians actually stuck. They have they just have stuck on the battlefield, and they have no.
They stopped for strategically or stuck for some other reasons.
Strategically, and they have bad lines of supplies. They have the chains of supply are broken in some places. Some are broken because of local logistics. Some places because of objective reasons. Like now we have -10. So -10. Can you imagine Russian Russian tank groups are just freezing their own tanks now? So so that's the reason they can't make a good supply. They can't supply army with everything they need. So this will be a second Afghanistan, even worse. And but actually, Russia will try to to escape from this second Afghanistan, because it already brings a great losses from high commercial circles, from trust to government. And high officials like financial and political, they understand that in the long run, this sanction will just kill the country. They will kill the Russian economy, and it will be just a corpse of something great. So the Russia will try to finish this as soon as possible. And for Ukraine, the only position is counterattack where they can and hold as long as they can and save as much resources as they can within all these fights.
But I also want to mention, Dmitry, you mentioned about supply shortage of the Russian troops, but I also want to mention that the Ukrainian army has been through a huge loss. There's been I think it's over 3,000 military infrastructure has been wiped out, but also that's the information provided by the Russian side. But there are reports about the military infrastructure in Ukraine has been wiped out. So your army has been through a huge loss.
As far as I contact with friends in military, people who are close to military, they say the spares are high. So I think it can be without any reason, right?
Yeah.
These guys, I think, know something. And for example, Russians say they destroyed some warehouse with javelins and like that Norwegian anti-tank missiles now. But as Ukrainians, I said, we don't put them just onto saving something. We just put them directly to the army. We put them directly to the front lines. So we don't have a big, warehouses with weapons, with supplies. Everything is closed, and everything we share is to small parts. That if one small part is lost, it doesn't mean that we lost everything. So there's also a plan of the strategy to avoid losses in supply.
Yeah, as Dmitry mentioned about this, he has Kent. Yeah, Dmitry has quite similar judgments like you, but seems the reason's a little bit different. Is that he thinks the supply is insufficient for Russian.
I'm not speaking not supply, but the whole spirit of Russian army and the whole spirit of Russian society, especially high levels of politicians, the political elites and economical elites. They were expected to have a blitzkrieg. They expected to have a fast war, which will be ended with Russian victory and parade in Kiev. But it hasn't happened like that. Yeah. Now Russia's stuck, as it happened a second Afghanistan. As we can see, even long wars are hard to take for American societies, for Western societies. So what can you say about Russian, which has great losses every day?
Gentlemen, you want to reply to this, or you agree with this? What Dmitry said?
实际上没有这个更多的回应吧。我只是想这个接着 Dmitry 这个话呢，这个
just would like to add up some more information after that contribution of Dmitry. Weather is an important factor, as is mentioned by Dmitry. That is also an important reason why massive operation can be put to an end. Currently is already spring season in Ukrainian side, and the ice and snow, they are thawing, and we've also read and also witnessed in the reports that the black soils, they are thawing. Is really bad news for the armored vehicles. And for both troops, they are highly armored. So after the thawing of the soil, it's very difficult.
Now both Kent and Dmitry agree that this conflict will be ended very soon. Professor Wang, what's your take on this issue? How long do you think the conflicts will get over?
好。
你好，王老师，王老师，对我们刚才已经讨论了，就每一个人都发表了他们的意见哈，就觉得这个军事冲突，有的人会觉得可能要几个月，还需要几个月的时间啊。但是像那个黄总和我们在乌克兰的那个 Dimitri， 他们都觉得可能会比较短的时间就会结束了。我们想听听您的见解。
So what's your take on that?
我认为啊，在未来的
这
个10到15天，那么说这场冲突啊，就应该有一个方向性的这样的定论。比如说我们现在看到俄方提出了停火的3个条件，无论是乌克兰还是俄罗斯，他们在3个停火条件上呢，已经达成了方向性的
some direction level agreements.
这个战场
And on the
这个
battlefield,
主动权俄军占优，
the Russian side has more
他不能
advantage.
也没有这样的准备继续
They
的
are
长
not
久
fully
的
prepared
那
for
么
a
打下去。
very long
所以呢，
period
在
of
于
fight on the ground.
双方都有这种谈判的意
Considering
义
both sides,
在
they are
当前情
holding
况下呢，这个谈判已经
this
进行了3
intention
轮。
for the
我们
talks,
得到最新的
and
消息
also
是，
based on the fact that there have
在
already
第
been
3
3
轮谈
rounds
判
of
当中，虽
talks.
然没有对外公布然后俄罗斯外
Though
长
for the
发
third
了
round
有
of
一
the
个谈话，
talks, we
他说
don't
在
have
第
the
3
written
次
report
谈
about
判当
the
中呢，
details,
俄
but
方
still
以法律草案
according
的
to
形
the
式
Foreign
向
Minister
乌方
of the
提供
Russian
了
side.
停火的这样的一个文
In the
件。
draft
然后乌
document,
方在
Russian
收
side has
到这
provided
个
conditions for the ceasefire,
这个法律草
and
案以后
after
呢，
the arrival
答
of
应
this
呢
document
尽
in the
快给予
Ukrainian
回
side,
复。
they
也
have
就是
printed
说
it
呢，我
out
为什么
and
做出这种10
will
到
study
15天
it.
这样的判
So
断
the
呢？
reason why
我
I've proposed
想
10
呢，
to
就是
15
未
days
来
before the
谈判已
ending of
经进
this
入了3
massive
轮，
conflict.
如果在未来的1周之
We
内
have already
还没
witnessed
有
the 3
定论
rounds of peaceful talks. For
那
the
么
next
说
week,
这
if
个未来
still
战
no
场
more
呢
major
会更加激
breakthrough,
烈。
we can
作为
expect to
乌
see
方来讲呢，
more
我觉得
fierce
乌
crossfires
方
on
他
the
也有他们
battleground.
手
And
里
for the
这
Ukrainian
个非
side,
常重
they
磅的
also
这个筹
have
码，
their ace in the
那
hole,
就是
which
乌
is
军在东部的
in the
大约10到11个旅的
eastern part
这样
of the
的
country.
主力，虽然
Around
被
10
围困，
brigades
但是呢，
of
仍
their
然
side have
是具
been
有战斗力的。
besieged, but
如果
still
说
they
未来
are
的战场发
fighting
展，
very
如果说俄
bravely. So
军
in the future,
他要想
if the
拿掉
Russian troops
这个乌
would
军主
like
力
to
的话，
wipe out the
那么说
effective
俄军
forces
他
of
也
the
会付
Ukrainian
出相当
side,
大
then
的
the
付出。
Ukrainian side
这就是
would
说俄军
impose
也
a
是
heavy
想
cost on the Russian
这个
side.
谈判的真实的原因。
So that's why
真正
both
战场
sides
上的
would like
形势
to
不身
go
临
to
其
the
境，我
negotiation
们
table,
都是属于
and
在观察。
we are
但我们
all
可以看一看
outsiders.
双方
We
最
are
高统
witnessing
帅
from
部
the
的这个
outside
意念，
world.
然后呢
We can
就
first
能
of all
反
study
映
the
出当
intentions
前
of the
战
top
场上
leaders
的
of
一
both
些真
sides,
实
and
情
we
况。
can
我们
have
知道现在乌方
in-depth
这个
understanding of this current
他是
situation.
很乐
For the
意谈判，
Ukrainian
他甚
side,
至请求德国
they are
总理
willing to
来
talk.
协调
They even asked
创
for
造
the
与
mediation
俄罗
of
斯
the German
总统普京的
chancellor,
这样的谈判。
even
那
for
这
a
个我们
creation of a
从
possible
这个
opportunity of
形势来
face-to-face
看呢，
between the
你
two
看这个
presidents.
整个战场上的形势
When we look at
是
the
对乌方
battlefield,
整体上来讲，
currently the
实事求是地
situation
说是不利的，
is
因为
not
对于
in the
东
best
部在10
interest
到11
of
个旅的主
Ukrainian.
力，他们目前
For
我们
the
得到的情
10
况
to
是，
11
它3个方向已经被围，只留
brigades
了西
in
方
the
在一
eastern
面，但是
part
制空
of
权
the
仍然在
country,
俄方的情况下，那么军
the
事专
sky
家
has been
就会
occupied
讲，那
by
么
the
说这个
Russian
主力
troops,
这个命运岌岌可危，
and the
他
destiny
很
can
可
still
能
be
无
created.
法或者说很难逃脱出最后被吃掉，或者说投
If they
降
cannot avoid the
这样
final
的局面
destiny of
但是这个
surrender
仗还没
or
有打，
being
打
wiped
呢
out by the
俄方
Russian
他要想取
enemies,
得
but still they
这
can
个
try their
消灭
best
乌
to
军
turn
主力
around the
的
situation.
这个目标呢，
For the
俄
goal
方
of the
付出的
Russian
代
side
价也
to
很
wipe
大。
out the
那
effective
在这种
forces
情况下，
of the
那个
Russian
乌克
of the
兰
Ukrainian
作为
side, they have to
谈
pay a
判
heavy
会
cost.
比较快的把这个战
So
争给
very
结束
soon,
掉，
both sides
对
will
吧
try to end this
OK, thank you.
conflict as soon as possible.
您还有什么
Do you
想
have
补充
anything to
您
add
说
up?
是这样，
Yes.
因为我认为留给谈判的时间那个窗
Currently,
口
the
期
window
不
time
多了
left for the
7到
next round
10
of
天
peaceful
差不
talks
多
is not that
那
long,
最多
10
也不会超过
days
2周或者说
and
15 天。
maximum calculation, maybe 7 to 10 or 5 to 10 days. If there's no result or breakthrough from the talks, then there will be more attacks and more massive operation for the Russian side.
That's a view from Professor Wang. And We're sorry, we don't have any time to translate what Professor Wang points to two of our guests online. But basically, Mr. Wang agreed that this conflict will be over within 2 weeks. They still focus on this intention and willingness from both sides is pretty strong to sit down for a talk. But also, as the Professor Wang said, that the time is getting very limited for them to reaching out to agreement. So let's get to another thing, because as Professor Wang mentioned about earlier, this is they've been talking 3 rounds of negotiation, and one of the major objective and major requirements from the Russian side is about the independence of this 2 region in Ukraine, which is Lugansk and Donetsk. So our second topic to forecast is what will be the future fate of this 2 area. Gentlemen?
这个是个非常复杂的问题 ，very very complicated question。这个目前呢实际情况我们现在来看一下，实际情况是这样。乌克兰东部地区呢，这两个
Towards the eastern part of
未被承认的共和国呢，已经
the
是
two
宣布独立，
self-declared
而且
republics,
呢
the LPR and
这个俄罗斯方面
DPR,
已经承认了
Russian side has
这两个
already
共和国独
recognized
立。
officially the
这个问题
independence
呢
of the
现在呢
two
也被摆到
republics,
谈判桌上，
and
但是呢
this
由于
topic
这
has
个
been
涉及
put
到
on the
这个
negotiation
民族主
table
权的问题，
because it's
乌
also
克
an
兰方面
issue
呢
related
肯
to
定
the
是不会承认
territorial
我相信在短
integrity.
期内
So
也
in
不
the
会获
short
得
term,
任何
it
承认。
cannot
当然
receive
这
the
个
recognition from the
随着这
Ukrainian
个军
government.
事这个行动的这
And
个进展
as the advancements
后
of
续还
military
有待
troops
观
going
察，但
on
是大概
on the
率
battlefield,
这
we
个
have to wait
双
and
方
see
最
the
后还
final
是以实
result.
际的控制线
And
为边界。
in the
就是
end,
现
they
在
will
现在
respect
这
the
个现
control
状可能
line.
会持续
And
相当
I
长的一
believe
段
that the
时间，也
status
就是
quo
说
can be
这两个地区
maintained
呢
for a long
只有莫
period
斯
to
科
come.
是吧？这个承
Only
认，当然
Moscow
后续的不
recognized
排
the
除，
two
比如像
self-declared
这个阿布
republics
哈兹啊，或者
currently.
像南奥塞梯
And
啊，
in
或
the
者德佐共
future,
和国呢，都会相继
maybe
承认
some
这两个共
more
和国
countries
独立。
would
但是
come
在
to
国际
recognize
社
the
会上，可能
independence
大部分人还
of
是
the
不会
two
承认它的这个独立。
self-declared republics,
总
and
体
they
上
cannot win the
应该是大约是
recognition
这
of
么
the
一个
majority of the countries in the world.
Sure, you agree?
Yeah, most of the situation will be remain the status quo because the two self-declared republics, they have declared their independence 8 years ago, and in the past 8 years, the Ukraine government cannot successfully have the kind of military control or political control in these 2 regions, and after this conflicts erupted, and you see the armed forces from these 2 regions now is pushing their front lines. They're getting more control of the land, so the status quo will remain. And of course, it's really hard to get a wider international recognition because the Ukraine governments will not accept the recognition for these 2 self-declared republics. So the fate will be the same as Mr. Kent said, like Abkhazia and others. Yeah.
But the Russian side has made it very clear. You have to recognize the independence of these 2 regions. Recognize them as the 2 independent countries, or I'm not going to stop this. Will they continue? If Ukraine failed to agree to that, will the Russian continue their military operation?
No. 这我认为这是2个问题，这是 totally different question。这是完全不同2个问题，就是说，实际上呢，我们现在看这个军事行动
When we
啊
look at the military operation now
这
on
个
the
2个
ground,
国这2
and
个国
also
承认
the
问题呢，
recognition
还不
on
在
the
一个层面
independence
上
of the two republics,
另外
they
呢，
are
像
two
世伟刚才
different
讲的，就是
questions. And
我
as
也
is
倾
mentioned
向
by
于这个
Shi
观
Wei,
点，就是任何
I
一个
also
乌克
agree
兰的
with
领导
him
人，
that
他都
for
不会
any
承认这
leader
个独
of
立是独立，因为这
Ukraine,
在
they
政
will
治
not
上的可能性
recognize
大，对吧？
those
这
two
是不可想
self-declared
象的。所以
republics
这个
with
问题
their
呢非常难解决，
independence.
就在于
They
呢，
will
他
not,
现在
they will never
由于目前这个
admit
局
the
势的发
independence,
展，
otherwise
造成
it
一种
will be a
结构性
political
的
suicide.
变成结构性
And
的问题。这些
currently,
结构性问题呢，你
those
短时
two
期内是很
areas
难
and
解
their
决的。
independence can be a structural problem.
Yeah, it is a political suicide for the leaders in Ukraine to recognize these 2 self-declared.
It's a political suicide, so I don't think.
Yeah, so the status quo remains, and maybe they just freeze this kind of debates when they will get diplomatic recognition, and what they want is the full control. And you see, from in the past 8 years, the Russia government is pushing a kind of economic integration with these 2 regions, and to even they issue the kind of passports to the citizens there. So it is pretty hard for Ukraine government to get full control, but to safeguard the national territorial integrity and to safeguard the territorial issue, the Ukraine government will not accept that condition.
Sheldon, go ahead. What's your take on
sure.
this?
I mean, I think the two new republics, maybe in the future they can be constitutionalized by the Russian-led referendums, because ethnically speaking, there are the heavily Russian-speaking population living there. So that's just, status quo is more likely to last.
Okay, so you mentioned about a strong bond of the people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so and also we've been joined by another screener, also been joined by CGTN reporter Guy Henderson in London. Hello, Guy. We've been talking about a forecast of you just come back from Ukraine. Today, what we do is just forecast the future of Ukraine, Russia, and Europe. And we've been talking about a future fate of the Lugansk and Donetsk. What's your take on them?
Well, I mean, the time I spent in Ukraine was all in the West, so it's hard to give a balanced view of how the entire country sees this conflict, but it's in a stronger way than ever. I think it's that people in the west of Ukraine are united in their opposition, and fiercely so, to the idea of even perhaps compromises that they might have been more willing to make before this conflict had broken out. So I think that one key thing to recognize is how much the facts on the ground have changed as a result of these rising tensions. There is a lot more determination, I would say, to be uncompromising than perhaps there would have been before there had been a military intervention. So, the mood for dialogue, the mood for a peaceful resolution, the mood for compromise has shifted very, very quickly, even in the time that I was there.
Okay. Daniel, what's your take on the future fate of these two regions, the Donetsk and the Luhansk? Because the Russian side has been made it very clear that they want the Ukraine to recognize their independence.
Well, I mean, this the status of Donetsk and Lugansk can't be viewed independently from what's going on in Ukraine. We've had a lot of predictions about this turning into a frozen conflict, and there are a number of
Daniel, can you turn on your camera? Conflicts. We can't see you right now. Can you turn on your camera?
Yeah, sure.
Yep. Hope to see you. Okay, you're back.
Yeah.
Go
sorry
ahead.
about that. Yeah,
Go ahead.
Reset, sorry. There are, of course, a number of so-called frozen conflicts in and around Eastern Europe and the south of Russia as well. Transnistria on the Moldova-Ukrainian border is one example of such a conflict. Abkhazia, South Ossetia, the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh as well, are subject to so-called frozen conflicts where these largely unrecognized republics or partly recognized, pseudo-republics, as many would call them, are in a sort of legal limbo and a military limbo at times. But these frozen conflicts are very different to what's going on in the republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, and very, very different to what's been going on there for the last 8 years. Certainly the Russian point of view is that the people in these republics have been subject to violence, to shelling, to danger for the last 8 years. And the Moscow's view is that that conflict was, if not completely ignored, at least put certainly on the back burner by Western powers and by Kiev. And part of the reason, part of the justification for this military action in Ukraine was to protect the people in those republics and to give them some sort of legal status, some sort of legal backing, hence Russia's recognition of those republics. As I said, the difference between the frozen conflicts I brought into example and Donetsk and Lugansk is that there is a state of conflict on the territory of Ukraine, and Donetsk and Lugansk are actively participating in that conflict. The militaries of those republics are moving forward. They're advancing to the borders of Donetsk and Lugansk, and they're likely to advance beyond those borders in support of Russian troops as they continue to make ground across Ukraine. So at this stage, it's hard to see what the future of those republics will be, independently of any sort of settlement that will happen between Moscow and Kiev in the medium and long term. As my colleague from the UK said, it's a very different situation in Western and Eastern Ukraine.
Yep.
Western Ukraine are very much, as we said, united in the face or against this Russian military intervention. Eastern Ukrainians, from the reporters, colleagues I've spoken to on the ground there and that have been on the ground there for many years, do view this intervention very, very differently. They do view Russia as effectively coming to the rescue, saving them from what they view as aggression by Ukrainian far-right groups. So this is very much a population divided with two very different narratives. I would say, if I was to make a prediction about the status of those republics, we are likely to see a frozen conflict. This depends on the red lines that Kiev puts forward. And so far, in terms of territorial integrity, in terms of territorial disputes, Kiev has made clear that the status of Crimea, which they view as temporarily occupied by Russia, the status of Donetsk and Lugansk, which they don't recognize as independent republics, of course, how much they're willing to compromise, and indeed how much the Western powers, NATO powers, are also willing to compromise on that. Because, as I said before, even if Kiev does sit down at the negotiation table with Moscow and compromise on the recognition of those republics as independent, as a recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, the NATO allies and Western allies of Ukraine are under no obligation to do so. So that's another key topic here. How the signatories to any sort of peace agreement, any signatories to any sort of security guarantees, how will they view the status of those republics? So I would say for now, very much a frozen conflict until we see an end to the active phase of military operations in Ukraine.
Okay, frozen conflict. Hi, Dmitry. You're coming from because, as Daniel mentioned, there are two parts: the western part and eastern part. They might have a different opinion on this issue. So you're from the western part. So in the daily life, even before this conflicts, how do you or the people surround you to treat the people from the Lugansk and Donetsk? Because as Chelan mentioned earlier, the people there have a very strong bond with Russia. So what is your take on this? Do you think Ukraine can accept this independence of these two regions?
I got your question, and I want to start a bit from history, from 2014, when the turnover on Lugansk and Donetsk region happened. That's an important point because at that time, my region, a lot of other places in Ukraine accepted refugees from Lugansk and Donetsk regions, people who were treated badly, who were by pro-Russian groups. Because at that time there were also people who were supporting government, who were supporting like that revolution of dignity in 2013-14, who were not supporting pro-Russian groups. That's the most important. So people who were supporting Ukraine at that time, they left that place. And I can tell you exact number of refugees, but my hometown also took some families, so amount is pretty big. That's the first point. The second point.
Dimitri, before you expanding on this, can you just give me a very quick conclusion about, or the judgment made by you about the future fate of this two region? How this two region will look like in the future?
I don't know. It's really a question without an answer. But I can say the fate of these regions gonna depend on the fate of Russia, what will happen in Russia, what political processes will run in Russia after the war in Ukraine. That's very important. Because it's very difficult to speak about Russian-supported parts of Ukraine without understanding and about having a clue what will happen in Russia in that period. Because it actually, the fate is very brief. my answer. The fate of these regions will directly depend of what will happen in Russia within 1 or 2 years, or even faster. Of that political processes which might happen in Russia very soon, like in a short run, like within a year.
Mm-hmm.
That's also, and about attitude towards Easterners from Ukraine. Well, I know a lot of people from East and West and from different parts of Ukraine, and now, like guys say, Western part is united, completely united. It's a bit difficult. It's a bit wrong. The whole Ukraine is united now. That's the important point. The whole Ukraine is supporting point of kind of fighting Russian aggression, and nobody will ask you, are you Easterner or Westerner? Because actually most parts of Ukraine are opposing Russian aggression. That's the key point of this.
Mm. Okay, so Professor Wan. Professor Wan, has everyone just shared with us about their the basic judgment on this Lugansk and Donetsk regions and the future fate. And as Ken just mentioned, the Ukraine cannot accept the independence of these two regions. But this current situation might remain for quite a long time. So in fact, they're just autonomous. They will become a very autonomous region. Am I correct? So what's your take? If this has become a case for that, what kind of influence? First of all, I want to hear about your takes on this, the future fate of these two regions. And second, if this goes on as what Ken just predicted, what kind of influential will it bring to this whole region in the future? 王老师。就是刚才我们也讨论了这个两个地区的一个未来的命运吧。我们想听一听您对这两个地区未来的一个可能性的一个判断。另外就是像刚才黄总提到的，如果它保持现在这个状态一个很长的时间，并且呢，乌克兰政府并不承认它，但是似乎也没有什么别的办法，它就保持现状，保持一个很长的时间。它作为一个范例被定下来，它会对整个地区的将来产生什么样的？
And what kind of influence will they have on the region? In 2014, Crimea has been annexed by Russia. Few regions, few countries now recognize independence. Now recognize the annexion of Crimea by Russia. In the future, maybe the two regions will also follow the example of Crimea. Russian side have proposed several conditions for ceasefire. One most difficult one is the recognition of Russian authority over the LPR, DPR, and also for Crimea. One possibility is the referendum. In the speech of Zelensky, he didn't mention that there is the dead end for the discussion about the future of the two regions. So there is still possibility in the future. It's still very early for us to tell the future fate for the two regions. First of all, we have to check the fate of its effective forces and also the fate of the major cities, for example, Kiev, Kharkiv, etc. And those possible peace talks that can bring us peace and stability, and also the possible face-to-face meeting between the two residents, whether they can bring a chance for peace development. I'd like to put the focus on that.
Thank you, Professor Wan. And there's more comments coming in from the Facebook pages. A lot of people, well, as Professor Wan mentioned, we should give the peace a chance, and there's a lot of this. A lot of our users are sharing the same points on this. The Johnson Lee said, "May peace come to Ukraine. After all, both Russian and Ukrainian have been sharing history and culture for such a long time." And this one says, "Just stop the fighting instead of ratcheting it up." Also, Okay, there's another comment said, stop war, so business of arms suppliers must stop. So peace in the region upscale. Thank you so much for all of those comments sending to us about our viewers, and keep writing the comments. Leave the message on YouTube or Facebook, and we can share those comments anytime we want. Okay, about this. So let's talk about the peaceful resolution. That's what we want. Everyone just are looking for this peace talk, and we know this foreign ministers meeting took place yesterday in Turkey. Even though there was no solid progress, it has been made. So I want to hear from you guys about your comments on this peaceful talk. What's your take on this peaceful talk, and what do you think might be a potential peaceful resolution for Ukraine?
这个昨天两国外长会见呢，结果大家也都知道了，是吧？这个双方的诉求呢，
and we all know the result. And we're also very clear about their intentions and their requirements. For the Ukrainian side, they believe that there's no major breakthrough coming out of this negotiation. And for the establishment of humanitarian corridors, the two sides have already reached a consensus. And Foreign Minister Lavrov has also stressed that Vladimir Putin, Russian president, has not refused to meet Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. They have not refused that demand. And in general, we can still find a lot of in-depth disagreements, but still there is a possibility for them to remain in contact through other channels. And in official negotiations, maybe they cannot draw a conclusion for now, but for the other channels, they may expect to see some progress. And it's also possible for us to see an early ceasefire in the short term to come. In the future, for the Donbas region in eastern part of the country and also for Crimea, we cannot solve and settle the issue only with a military operation, and you cannot solve the problem overnight. In general, I've noticed that the two parts, they have the intention to go back to the Normandy format. So maybe they can go back to the Normandy format, and with the mediation of France and Germany, they can conclude a new Minsk agreement for a new era. And another optimistic element is that they have shown their willingness to stay in contact and communicate.
Thanks, Kent. You just to give out as a new possibility, as a new pact might be a new negotiations. A military operation will be end very soon, but this talk could be turned into a long-term talk. Yeah. So Shuve, what do you think is the biggest obstacle in their in this peaceful in the way of reaching out the peaceful resolution?
I think the most difficult part is how to implement the peaceful negotiation, especially for these kind of conditions. Because if, for example, first is about neutrality, that is Moscow's demand. So if Ukraine government accepted that kind of condition, that means it must have these amendments of the constitution to erase the article that Ukraine want to seek NATO membership. That must be changed. That needs a lot of paperwork in the parliament of Ukraine, so that will take a pretty long time. That is for political solution. And second, about the future the political status for the two self-declared republics and also Crimea. I think that would take a much longer time, because any changes of the boundary and also about the territorial issue, that must be decided not just by the President Zelensky, but also for the parliament of Ukraine. So technically speaking, that will take a pretty long time. Even it is pretty hard, because for the politicians in Kiev, no one has the courage to accept that one, because that means the political suicide. So I think that is a very difficult one. So, and for the third one, I think in the future, maybe the two self-declared republics will be barred from international market, because previously you see from Zelensky's presidential order that all trades from these two regions were forbidden to enter the market in other parts of the Ukraine. So I think in the future, the Ukraine government will put more weight on these issues, especially economic sanctions, and also to lobby its Western allies to give more pressure to these two regions. So I think even after this kind of military operation, the political solutions need a lot of procedures, paperwork, arguments, and also debates to implement, not only from both sides, but also within Ukrainian side.
And Chow?
Yeah, sure. And we talked about this yesterday, actually. Ukraine proposed this non-NATO model for further solutions. So it's definitely a positive sign. At least the two parties are moving toward each other, not to move away from each other, which is also good. Meanwhile, I think it also gives other European nations, especially France and Germany, a moment, some time to think about it and to make further negotiation or to use diplomatic means to make peace. Because by all means, this conflict started because of NATO expansion. So this is against some of the European nations' fundamental interests as well. So all parties must bear it in mind. So this should be solved in a peaceful way, but not use violent means.
Actually, in this under current situation, France and Germany, they have different approaches with their U.S. allies. So they want to have this kind of diplomatic solutions, and they are pushing each side to have a peaceful talks, either through different channels like Turkey or other sides. They want kind of this issue. But so what worries us most is if Ukraine wants to use this kind of opportunity to prolong this kind of conflict so that they can win more support from the West, that will make this current situation more complicated. And that's why we need to support EU on this issue, especially EU is suffering the most, and this is the humanitarian crisis will be worsened, and that is the results were not expected by the European Union. So maybe diplomatic solutions proposed by Germany and France shall be encouraged by the international community, especially among the major powers, to give peace more chance for the peaceful negotiation, especially for the diplomatic solutions.
对这个里边呢，我认为世伟讲的也很正确。当然，对于欧洲来讲，他肯定是倾向于这个通过。
They prefer to settle the situation and the conflict with peaceful talks. And of course, Europe would not want to see the flames of the war in their continent. This is not in the interest of Europe. When we look at the bigger picture, between Europe and Russia, they have this in-depth cooperation for energy. So from this point of view, the current Russian-Ukrainian tensions will not fall into the best interest of Europe, and Europe is not sharing the same point of view of the US, and we can expect to see a possible version of the future for the mediation of the political forces. They will come back to the Normandy format and sign a new document. And talking about the future for the neutrality of Ukraine, we have to wait and see. And for the current stage of development, for the political and diplomatic mediation, Russian and Ukrainian delegations are on the negotiation table. However, the other major forces in the economy world, they are also playing their role.
Well, I can understand this is the question that needs a lot of a technical analysis on this. So I want to keep this discussion a little bit more open. So let's forecast about the future of Ukraine as the country, and also the Russia, even after this conflict, because as lots of us have been talking about, this a military operation will be end quite soon. Someone said it's 15 and 20 days, someone says a few months, but that will be over ultimately. But after that, how this, what's going to happen to this country and what those countries will look like in the future, and also including Europe. The whole Europe will be changed. Definitely.
Yeah.
So, so I want to keep this discussion a little bit more open. So I want to hear your forecast. Gentlemen, I want to hear your forecast on the future fate of those countries. But before that, let's take a look at the first clip. We have a video to show you about as our reporters and a strainer have interviewed those Ukrainian refugees and people who are now still in Ukraine or maybe outside of the Ukraine, what they're feeling and they're thinking about their future and their country's future. Take a look. Well, that's the video footage that has been filmed by a reporter and a strainer in Ukraine. And they interview with the local people to talk about their feeling and talked about their futures, a future plan, and also including the future of their country. So this time, how about we start with our guest online? Maybe we're from Dmitry. I want to hear from you about your forecast, about your country. I know it's just so hard for you to say something like that, but give us your judgment of what the future of Ukraine.
Well, as speakers before me told, nobody is interested in prolonging this war because mostly civilians are suffering losses. About future of Ukraine, well, it's difficult to say, but as I have told before, this war is a factor of unification of Ukrainian nation, of Ukrainian population. We can see a lot of people coming, especially men, are coming back to Ukraine to join the Ukrainian army. So people believe in our army, people believe in our government, and people believe in the president, which was not believed at the very beginning. So it's difficult for me to make any long-running forecast for Ukraine. Are you speaking just about Ukraine or the picture in general? I'm just clarifying. Are we speaking just about some issues, not only about Ukraine?
What do you want to say about?
Well, I want to, because now you're asking me about Ukraine, and now Ukraine is united and it's ready to rebuild the country using as you can know, there are a lot of funds which are prepared for funding Ukraine, for rebuilding Ukraine. Ukraine also expects to get reparation from Russian side, maybe from the funds which were frozen in international banks. Ukraine start nationalizing all property which belongs to Russian Federation owners. So we will rebuild the country. That's the only forecast. I don't know how successful it will be because everything also depends on in which line Russian troops gonna stop, about withdrawal of Russian troops for Ukraine, about the future of Donetsk and Lugansk, about future of Crimea, because this issue is also doubtful for me in the long run. So the only prediction for Ukraine is starting rebuilding country as soon as will be possible. Of course, it's difficult to speak about Donetsk, Lugansk, about the status, about recognition of that. quasi-states and about the future of Crimea, which, as I said, is doubtful for me because, well, as my prediction, after the end of the war or some process of erosion might start inside the Russian Federation. I know this it's very brave forecast, but as we can see, Russian nation elites has already problems inside of them, and economical issues, economical sanctions of West might influence that process inside Russia, and well, there are a lot of very catastrophic forecasts for Russian Federation, even catastrophic.
So what's your forecast to the future of Russia?
Well, it might come it can happen the same as happened with USSR. It might be a process of it might be even a process of deep disintegration.
Okay, so you think the Russian will we have a very severe consequences after this conflict? We totally understand this.
No, I'm not speaking from patriotic thinking. I just put that aside. But economic sanctions, we can see that the war of Afghanistan was crucial for Soviet Union. It was crucial for Soviet Union disintegration and for the social and economic processes inside the country.
Yeah, we.
So it can be the. So it might happen the same as Russia at this point. Because economic consequences for Russian Federation will be much harder to overcome that consequences after the Afghan war.
It's not hard to think about this. The Russians are going to have a very tough time after this. There is the comments on the YouTube said if peace negotiations reached, will West world stop sanction on Russia and everything is back to normal? Gentlemen, who wants to replies to this?
实际的现实情况是，这个制裁恐怕在短期内不会结束啊，即便这个启动终止制裁这个进程它也会持续很长时间。
Once we have already mobilized that mechanism, we can expect to see that those sanctions remain for a certain period of time. And for the Western countries, including the US, they have already used these sanctions as a bargain chip in their political dialogue. They will not easily abandon this bargain chip. In general, I personally believe that this round of negotiations can have a heavy blow to the Russian economy, and for the potential effects they can.
And also from the legal and the technical perspective, when the U.S. and also its Western allies design this kind of sanction system, most of the bills and acts will overlap each other, and they have the internal links with each other. So it is pretty hard to remove several parts and several sections from these sanction systems. If we take U.S. sanctions against many other countries, you see for the negotiations to lift these kind of embargoes or sanctions, that will take a lot of time, a lot of paperwork, even that will become a political issue within the U.S. In the Capitol Hill, you see because different sanction bills were proposed by different congressmen, and sometimes they cooperate, but sometimes they quarrel with each other. So from legal and technical perspective, once the sanctions were implemented, it is pretty hard for them to remove these kind of sanctions. And as Mr. Ken said, it has become a politicalized weapon against their enemy. And if we go through U.S. national security agenda and also for its plan, Russia is one of the main targets. So it is very hard for Washington decision makers to lift any sanctions, because these sanctions, they want these sanctions to work and to destroy Russia's economy.
不光是这个摧毁俄罗斯经济的问题啊，这个我们如果是看一下这个数据啊，如果我没记错的话，目前呢，针对俄罗斯制裁
If my memory is correct, there are 2,800 or 2,800 categories of sanctions against the Russian economy, and more details about 5,600 items of sanctions against the Russian economy. That is unseen in the human history, and that is the largest ever sanctions. And from the point of view of China, we always oppose to unilateral sanctions because we don't believe that they will help to solve the problem. They will just help to escalate the situation. So considering Russia a major nuclear power and economic power in the world, they will not surrender in front of these economic sanctions, and they will not make any compromises. Because, for the diplomatic fronts, sometimes they will make some compromises, and that is after the in-depth negotiations and talks. Only by the unilateral imposing of the sanctions, it cannot work. And earlier this day, the two sessions have successfully concluded, and in the press conference delivered by Premier Li, it is once again stressed that the sanctions will not only bring a heavy blow to the Russian economy, but also it can impose a heavy cost to the world economy. So we hope that we will not only resort to those unilateral sanctions to solve the problem. We all have a figure. For example, the price of the oil, if it is above $150 per barrel, then at least 7% of the world GDP will be wasted and be spent on that. It can directly cause the downward economic pressure. It can slow down the world economy. And this history has been repeated time and time again once the oil prices go up $150 per barrel. So that will be a huge risk for the economic downturn development. So that is not only
let's talk to
for
Guy
US.
Henderson in London. Hi, Guy. You're right now in UK, and you want to share something about us about the future of Europe after this whole crisis, and also maybe you can share with us some of your view on the future of Russia, because as we discussed in the chat room here in Beijing, we believe the sanctions will not be removed in the short term.
I'm going to start with a conversation I had with a group of Ukrainians back in mid-February, so before the conflict had started. Mm-hmm. And it was during the Munich Security Conference. And it was the point when the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had addressed the Munich Security Conference and had spoken about how, had made the point during his speech that the territorial integrity of every country should be respected. And he singled out including Ukraine. And it was really interesting talking to Ukrainians about that point at the time, because it really meant something to them. And it really caused a lot of discussion amongst friends and colleagues in Kiev while we were there. And, China has been quite critical, I think, of aspects of this conflict with comments like that. And I know we've seen more recently the sort of more active suggestion and call that I know that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, had with the leaders of France and Germany earlier this week, mm-hmm. About helping find what role China could play in bringing a diplomatic solution. You're asking me about the future of Ukraine, but I actually think that in the mind of quite a few Ukrainians, that could become clearer when China's position becomes clearer in this conflict, because it has a huge amount of influence in Moscow. And I think speaking to Ukrainians, it was clear that they're really hoping that China can play a really active role here, and that could be something that really shifts the balance and the future of that region and the future of the conflict quite significantly. I'm sort of getting slightly out of my remit of coverage here. I mean, I'd always be interested to hear what you guys in China think about it. I mean, thinking about the sort of balance, I guess on the one hand, China's a country, right, that has a very close relationship with Russia. It also sees an interest perhaps in slowing NATO expansion, but on the other hand, it's also trying to...
Hi, Guy. I think China has made a pretty clear statement about this in both the press conference of the Foreign Minister Wang Yi and also this morning with Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. They have all made a very clear stance on China said they have to express their stance on the Ukrainian issue. They're calling for both sides to get back to the negotiation table, and they believe this is the only way to resolve this crisis. I think they made a pretty clear statement on this. And now it's up to the both sides. It's up to this international diplomatic efforts to this. Let's just focus on this, the fate of the Ukraine, Russia, and maybe from your perspective, because you're now in UK, you've been covering the Europe news a lot. What is your takes about the future or the influence that this crisis brings to the whole Europe?
Well, I mean, it's highly uncertain times, and it's part, is it not, of a much wider debate around where the world is going. I think another thing that's really shifted from the European perspective is that it has brought about, not just within Ukraine's borders, but across the Western world, a sort of renewed sense of unity. And so I guess there was a lot of discussion and debate around post-Brexit, the rise of populism, the divisions that were caused by the refugee crisis. We're now in a situation where this crisis seems to have almost belittled some of those divisions in a way. It seems like a discussion, many of those sort of divisive debates are sort of behind us and part of another era that ended on the 24th of February 2022. So I think that's a big factor that has changed. All of those divisions and criticisms that were often levelled at the European Union for not being able to get its act together and move efficiently, and now it has taken these quite firm, united stances when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to providing Ukraine with lethal weaponry. So a new unity, I suppose, that perhaps
are we going to see a more? I want to talk a little bit more about the future of the Europe. Are we going to see a more united Europe, or are we going to see a more divided Europe in the future after this whole crisis?
Well, that was kind of the main point I was making, really. There is definitely a sense of a new unity of purpose and policy because of this crisis. I mean, it was interesting during the build-up of tensions between Russia and Western countries, where initially Vladimir Putin had issued those draft treaties and then said, essentially ratify those treaties or we will take military technical measures. And by early January, that had shifted that stance. And there was a time where you felt, well, maybe there's a sense here that it could be beneficial for him to bide his time, because actually we're already seeing cracks appearing in the Western alliance in terms of what approach they should take to sanctions and providing lethal aid and all that kind of thing. So I think there was a time when there was a sense of divisions between the Western countries, but I think that's shifted quite significantly now.
Okay. Let's move to Daniel in Moscow, and we'll still remain on this the issue of the future of the Russia. What is your take on Russia's future? And we all know this country is going to have a very tough time after this. So what would be your forecast to this country?
Well, I'd probably like to start with just make a couple of comments about the things my colleague has said, specifically to do with Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, and also to do with sanctions and how they're going to impact domestic political discourse in Russia. I would say it's probably preemptive to draw comparisons between the Afghan war and the collapse of the Soviet Union. These are two very different conflicts in two very different eras. And while certainly the Afghan war, which went on for, I believe, around 10 years towards the end of the Soviet Union, may have been one of the contributing factors towards the demise of that country, of that empire, there was a whole host of other factors which did lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union, from various independence, nationalist movements in the states that made up the Soviet Union, economic issues, the oil crisis. There was a whole host of factors. So I would say it's preemptive to draw direct comparisons to that. The other thing I would say is Russia is, of course, now the most sanctioned country in the world. I think the latest statistics, there was around between 4,000 and 6,000 sanctions in place against Russia, Russia-linked entities and individuals. The other countries down that list, next in line is Iran. You've got countries like Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, which has been subject to US very strict sanctions for 60 years plus, and they've been actually roundly condemned by the UN on many occasions. What I would say is the sanctions against those countries in any of those cases have not led to a disintegration of those countries or to a change of regime. The government of Iran is still in place. Cuba is still a socialist state. Venezuela as well, North Korea. These sanctions have really failed to achieve their aims. It's brought Iran certainly to the negotiating table in terms of the nuclear deal, which is on the brink of being resolved and signed. Russia being one of the parties, the signatories to that deal, of course. But in terms of the aims of those sanctions, to cause some sort of tumultuous collapse, regime change, they failed. And I don't see how the sanctions against Russia will be any different. Russia does face a very tough time. I think many officials in Russia are acknowledging that. But in terms of the future of Russia, again, I think the key question will be what happens in Ukraine. And perhaps I can direct a question shortly back to my colleague in Ukraine, Mr. Dmytro, who said that, we've been making these predictions over the last half an hour. When things are going to end? Is it in a week, in 2 weeks, in a month? And we've all made, these predictions. But the key question isn't when, but how things are going to end. I just don't see, and perhaps Mr. Dmytro can comment on this, is it really realistic to predict that in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, Russian troops are simply going to turn around and leave the country, and the Kremlin, Mr. Putin's going to say, okay, look, we admit that our intervention, operation, invasion, whatever you want to call it, has failed. That's it, we're going, and the sanctions are going to be lifted. Is that really a realistic scenario? I mean, for me, that scenario is highly unrealistic. So before I do carry on with the future of Russia, perhaps I'd like to get an answer from Dmytro about what he thinks will be the end in 2 weeks' time, if I may, of course.
Yeah, Professor Wang, what was your forecast about this, the future on its three, on Ukraine and on Russia, and also in Europe? 王老师，你觉得这个就是整个的这个冲突结束以后啊，冲突总有一天会结束的。它结束之后，这个乌克兰和俄罗斯会变成什么样的国家？他们的这个未来是什么样子的？然后。
What their future fate be, and what's the changes for Europe as a whole?
乌克兰有俄罗斯，它是
Ukraine and
都是属于这个
Russia.
斯拉夫民族
They all belong to the Slavs
同
ethnic
宗
groups.
同族
They have the
的一对兄
same
弟。
ancestors.
那么说冲突之后的
After the conflict of this
乌克兰
time,
有俄罗斯的关
the
系
relations between Russia and Ukraine.
在安全上，那
From my personal view,
乌克
on
兰
the
可
security
能更
level,
多的要
Ukrainian side will be more dependent
当然
on
我也看
Russia.
到有争论的观点，乌克兰
I've
讲
also read
不
another
仅仅
point
是
of
俄罗
view,
斯也有可能会有其他的国
not
家。
only Russia but also other
乌克
countries.
兰的条件非常好。
Ukraine has enjoyed really good conditions
这是在苏联解体
of geography and the other
条件
sides.
非常好。
Even before the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, Ukrainians have been enjoying very good conditions. If they put the focus on developing the economy, the society, art, culture, etc., they can also embrace a very bright future. This is without any doubt. However, after 3 decades of independence, Ukraine has become the least developed country in Europe. They are choosing their allies. However, that is not the correct direction. Do you believe that this conflict will change that status quo? Yes, of course. In the negotiations, the first condition proposed has also been a common ground for both sides, the neutrality of Ukraine.
Okay. So as Professor Wang said, the future of Ukraine will be keeping a neutrality. Anything you want to add to this forecast about Ukraine, Russia, or Europe? Anything you want to add? Because this round of talk we started from their guest online. Now we get back to the chat room in Beijing.
I'd like to add up some more.
整体上看呢，这一轮
In
冲突结束
general,
之后
after the end of this round of conflict,
我的一般的预测就是
my personal prediction
俄罗斯和乌克兰呢会在
is that
方式下吧，达成了一个最终的一个
Russia and Ukraine could come to a settlement of ceasefire of this situation, whether it's a Normandy format or another Minsk agreement. Anyway, it's in a written form. At the same time, Russian side, they will also be withdrawing from the current battlefield in Ukraine. For Donbas region, they will maintain the status quo, and Russia and Ukraine, they will both declare victory over this military operation. And for the European side, the disagreement will continue to remain. For example, Poland until Czech Republic, Romania, those new European countries, they will be more dependent on the strategic level on US. France and Germany, they will possibly increase their cooperation with Russia, especially for Germany. When we look at the industries from Germany, they have a high level of mutual complementary with the Russian industries. From the US point of view, if EU works closer with Russia, of course, they will damage the interest of the US. But whether there will be future conflicts, we have to wait and see. Currently, the sanctions are going on. Of course, there will be a heavy blow on the Russian economy. That is without any doubt.
How Russia and Ukraine will coexist in the future after this crisis?
For the neutrality, Ukraine's status as a neutral state must be achieved from both sides' political agenda. But I think for the citizens in the two countries, sadly, I think the hate, the seed of hate has been planted in their hearts, and especially when you go through the social media, you see different kind of platforms that they hate each other. They have this kind of verbal violence, and there are some casualties. You see that will affect the future generation, especially for the young generations. What they see is the conflict, the war, and I think that's the wound of we need a lot of time to heal the wounds. And for the second part, I think sadly we will see a more divided and splitted supply chains, because you see for all these kind of sanctions, many industries from Russia cannot be exported to Europe market and also to supply the international market. And you see also from Russia side, they have this kind of export ban for certain elements, especially for the aerospace and other key parts in the global supply chains. And especially after this kind of crisis, the Europeans are going to rethink about their security framework, and especially for the security of the supply chains, and they must find some other alternative and resources, and especially for the companies, big or small, because of the sanctions, because they are afraid of targeted by some certain banks for kicking them out of the US dollar payment system. They are maybe afraid of dealing business with Russia. So you see, for many people and for the politicians, for the supply chains, for business, big or small, they are seeking a more diversified supply chains. That means we are going to see a more divided supply chains, and that is pretty sad, because that will raise costs, and that will contribute for the inflation. That means the higher cost for our daily life.
Yeah. Charlie, I want to start you before we kick off our final stage of forecast today on the future of the world that we're living in the coming decades. What was your take on this? We didn't talk too much about the United States.
Yeah, sure.
But now I think it's time to bring all the elements into our discussion.
Yeah.
What kind of the world are we going to live in coming
actually,
years?
in many ways, I was just thinking, in many ways, this conflict was actually one of the legacies of the Cold War. So especially we're dealing with many of this leftover issues. So I would say many of us, most of us, and most countries in the world would agree that 21st century is a time era for multilateralism, for a multipolar world. So in many ways, unilateral way of handling international issues and world affairs does not work and will not work. So in a way, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, both parties are being dragged into this conflict. While the expansion of NATO deliberately forgotten the need of security from the Russia side, that actually and dragged Ukraine, using Ukraine as the fortress for its own expansion, could be the cause of this conflict, could be the fundamental cause of this conflict. So I would say, just like Guy, our stringer, said online, that maybe in Europe, a new sense of unity is forming, is emerging, which is a positive sign. So many of the European nations need to think for themselves, right? If they can form a new unity, they don't need another great power to be in charge of their own security anymore.
That's a big change after the Cold War era. So Daniel, do you believe we're entering another round of the Cold War after this whole crisis, or what our world looks like in the future?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, mentioned yesterday in his press conference a very interesting phrase that a cold peace is better than a cold war. Certainly we are seeing a lot of references to the Cold War. We have seen a lot of references over the past months and years. US-Russia relations have certainly been at an all-time low as Russia has gone on to the situation with the Ukraine conflict. I think a colleague in the studio was also very right in speaking about the restructuring of the power balance in the world, a move away from unilateralism to multilateralism, and this is something the UK Foreign Secretary also spoke about: the restructuring of the European security model, the European security structure. This is likely to have repercussions in terms of global economy, of course, as well, a move away from the US-dominated petrodollar to trading and exchanges in other currencies, Eastern currencies. Certainly, we're likely to see Russia as well, obviously, in its current situation with Western companies leaving the country with the Western sanctions, making a pivot, a very big pivot politically, economically, to the east. That's something we'll probably talk about in later episodes, towards the countries that, if they didn't support Russia, at least refused to condemn it outright in those UN votes on the conflict in Ukraine. I'm talking about China, India, Pakistan, those countries as well. So it's certainly going to be a key few weeks and months in how this is going to develop. But in the long run, certainly, yeah, we are likely to see some global changes in terms of power balance, both from a military point of view, from an economic point of view as well.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Professor Wang, what kind of a global landscape that we're looking at? 王老师，我们这个怎么来看这个未来的这个世界格局呢？就是经过了这一次俄乌之间的这个危机，在一个更长远的。
I believe that in the future, the world landscape would move towards multilateralism. That is very obvious. So let's take an objective stance to comment on the Russian-Ukrainian tensions. Western powers are making more allies. They're unifying more allies in order to curb the special military operation of the Russian side. However, they cannot have their goals achieved. In the past, there's one superpower in the world, and gradually we see the world moving towards multilateralism.
Professor Wang. So, Dmitry, you want to share with us your future plan and your takes on this issue about the future of our world?
Yeah, but I first want answer for Professor Wang， 就是王老师，就是从2月24号。
Professor Wang,
why Dmitry is changing
from the 24th of February.
都不是兄弟，应该了解这个方面，已经不是往往不以后就是100年后。50年后，这个兄弟关系这样完全不可能的，乌克兰和俄罗斯民族就是感觉互相感觉。
Dmitry, can you speak English? Can you turn back to the English? It's for
okay.
Yeah. So our viewers understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, but I actually wanted to underline my saying to Professor Wang.
You can talk to Professor Wang offline after the show, but now please speak.
Well, no. But actually, about future of the world will be different. It has been start changing since 24th of March, or not March or February. So, what will be the consequences? I think it will be new camps, new ideas, new ways of development of the world. How it will be. The chains of supplyment will change. Everything will change. I think, and as we can see, the United Nations doesn't work well. It can't prevent conflicts, and that's big scale conflict. That's the issue. The United Nations system doesn't work.
Okay.
That's the biggest point. And negotiation is the best way to deal all the things, all the ways, all the conflicts, on all the issues. That's what I want to underline. And Ukraine was open to negotiations.
Okay, thank you, Dmitry.
It was also open to negotiations, but it wasn't Ukraine who started this war.
Thank you, Dmitry, for your. I agree with you. The negotiation. We have to resolve all of the crisis through negotiation. Okay, Guy, I realized you're still with us. You want to add something to this? What the landscape of the world is going to change after this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose before the conflict started, there was perhaps hope. I most often heard it expressed by the French government, actually, that perhaps out of this crisis could be still an opportunity to really have a serious discussion about redesigning certainly the European security architecture so that you could find a way for, two powerful actors who had very different ideas about how the world should be to work out how they could live together and peacefully coexist in a sort of constructive and cooperative way. I think now that the conflict has broken out, the precedent that would be set by compromising would also be a dangerous one. So perhaps for now, all that talk of a frozen conflict being the best outcome, in the shorter term at least, that perhaps seems like a more realistic outcome. But I hold out hope that the reality is, without getting too lofty, we live in a world where there are very different parts of the world that have very different ideas about how the world should be and what the best way to govern nations is. And I still hold out hope that everyone can accept that that's okay, and we just need to work out a way that we can all live with those different points of view on the same planet.
Thank you, Guy. Hope is the best things. Let's get back to this chat room in Beijing. Gentlemen, you want to wrap up this forecast with you? I think Jialian just shared his point about Xu Wei. And Kent, what's your point on this? We have to
about
wrap
the
up
future?
about our future. What is your takes on the future of the world?
I think it is still about the supply chain. It's more divided. That will force every country to reconsider its policies, especially how to survive from this kind of power geopolitical games. Especially for the regional security issue, they must to design a kind of framework to prevent any conflicts, especially for the escalation. As some of our guests mentioned, the UN haven't functioned pretty well. That means we need more solutions to make the peace framework more functioning, so they can prevent any further conflicts. So I think that is the main issue. And for the other issue, I think it's for the regulators about the social media, because recently we see a lot of issues, different narratives, and especially for on different platforms, there are verbal violence, there are a bully on the internet. So I think in the future, that is a task for many countries, internet regulators, and also for the tech companies, how to keep ourselves safe from this kind of information warfare. And that is a huge task, but that will affect many of us, especially for the ordinary people in today's world.
Yeah, that is a new term called internet governance, which is a new area that a lot of the scholars has been
and
doing
also
research
tech
on.
companies, they're working on this issue. So that is the task for every one of us.
Yeah, Ken, you want to wrap up this today?
对，我简单补充两句吧。
very
第一呢，
briefly,
我认为
I'd
呢，
like to add up, first of all,
我们实际上正在见证历史。
we are witnessing the development of the history.
军事
For
冲
this
突
round
呢
of
它实际上
military
给欧洲的
conflict,
整个地缘政治
it
带
has
来了
brought
结构性
to
的改变，而且这个结
the
构性的改变
European
它影响深远，
geographic
要持续甚至是
geopolitical
一个世纪的
structure
时间。
a
第二
big
呢，
change.
我认为呢，这个全球化的趋势呢，实际是不可逆的。
And secondly, that momentum of globalization cannot be reversed and cannot be changed. When we look back,
只不过是全球化进程
this
当中的一
conflict
个
between
里程碑的
Russia
事件
and Ukraine
在此之
is
后呢，我相
just
信呢，这个
one of the milestones of the
全球的产业的关
globalization.
联
In the
会非常
future,
这个
the
密切，
global
而且
supply
地区
chain
间的
and
这个
industrial
一体化
chains
进
will
程
be
也会加速
closely
这个加速
cooperating,
推进
and they will be
第
accelerating
三呢，我
globalization.
觉得呢，就是最
And
终啊，我们还
thirdly,
是会
I believe
这个回到一个共
that
同认知
we
上，
will
就是
come
实
back
际上
to
人类呢，
the
当然它是一个共同
common
的一个命运。
knowledge. We talk
我们
about
最
this
终啊会认
community
识到
of
这
shared
个
future
和
for
而不同呢
mankind.
是一个非
We
常
have to
我们
learn
应
to
该共同遵守的
agree
一
to
个价值理
disagree.
念。
That
这
is
是
a
我们
value
实际在
to
未来我们
follow
也
and
看
to
到了
keep.
这个大家应该不以意识形态划
In
界。
the
实际上
future, we
我
should
们
not be divided
就是在
according
现
to
在这
difference
个
of
当前的
ideology.
这个国际
Even
国际格局
considering
下
the current
也有很多这
international
个大国之
structure
间
among
抛弃
major
形态
powers,
这
they
个
have
是吧
set aside
这
the
个成功合作
ideological
的这个例子也是
differences
可以
and
接
they
受。所以我
have
想
set
这
a
可能
lot
是
of
一个
good
大的方
examples
向。
of cooperation. So that is the direction
Thank
to
you so much.
follow.
Thank you, gentlemen, and also our CGTN reporter and strainer around the world who has been involved in this discussion. I'd appreciate it. This is the informative discussion and great debate about the Ukraine and Russian crisis. Thank you so much. And in the following days, we're going to have a break.
Yeah.
Likely, we're going to have a break during the weekend, but the more chat room is on their way for you. So you can still stick around with CGTN. You can check out our website. You can check out our YouTube channel and the Facebook pages for the replay of the previous episode of our chat room, where we talk the different aspects about this crisis. We believe it's going to give you a full picture about this whole crisis. Thank you so much. This is Chat Room, and I'm Yang Zhao, and bye for now.